in interviews.
In this library at Rice University in Houston, the artifacts of people's lives wait for someone to unbox them. Ann Chow is the co-founder of a project to discover their stories.
We had film crews from the West Coast coming to do a documentary on Asian American in the Southwest. And we also have journalists inquiring.
This is just a fraction of what makes up the Houston Asian American Archive.
Hammer.
There are also some 500 first-hand accounts, oral histories of Asian immigrants and their descendants.
Oral history gives you a sense of immediacy and maybe a more informality, and it's also unfiltered.
My father came from China.
And unlike most of their counterparts, these immigrants ventured away from Asian enclaves in San Francisco and even New York, choosing instead to settle much further south in Houston, Texas. Among these letters, diaries, and old newspaper clippings are pieces of Albert G's life, donated by his daughters.
Albert G. CACA plaque.
G's daughter, Linda Wu, still has some of her father's photos.
They were also invited to the White House for a state dinner, I think.
G was a mover and shaker in his time, but it didn't start that way.
My dad was born here in the United States. His father and mother had a laundry, and he was, I believe their family business was in New Orleans.
When G's father died in 1927, he and his brothers went to China with his mother, but G returned with his godfather a few years later.
Albert found himself only around 11 years old, coming back to the United States.
G started in San Francisco, California, and ended up in Houston, with help from friends and relatives along the way. His two brothers also eventually returned to the U.S.
He was just working and, trying to send money back to his mother. Cantonese dishes.
G eventually opened grocery stores and restaurants, which became a draw for Hollywood celebrities who would stay at a nearby hotel.
Here we have Bob Hope.
He's often in society pages and became the darling of the Chinese restaurant scene for the Houston society.
Wu says her parents saw themselves as Americans, but never forgot their roots. They tried to help other Chinese settle when they arrived.
I always remember different people coming to live with us at the grocery store, family members who would, start their roots here.
It's this assistance to Chinese newcomers that fueled the growth of the G family surname in Houston. There are so many G's here that this book was created. A search in the Houston Asian American Archive reveals a plethora of G's, and there are plenty more who are not in the archives, including Rogine G. Calvert's father, David G.
For the G family, it's been discerned that we've come from about 3 to 4 villages in China.
Some G's are related, others are not. As for David G., he migrated to the U.S. from China in the late 1920s when he was 17 years old, even though his passport indicated he was 4 years younger.
But at that time, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act in full force, so Chinese were really it was not open for Chinese to come here unless you were a certain class, very restrictive.
Chinese people were not allowed except for merchants. So merchants were allowed, or you had to trade or so forth. Diplomats, of course, were allowed in, and students were allowed in. That's actually an impetus for the starting up of small businesses.
Many Chinese living in the U.S. at the time had grocery stores, but Calvert's father was not a merchant, diplomat, or student. He arrived as a so-called paper son.
Paper sons and paper daughters are the name given to people who buy false papers. It's sold in a black market. It's about $100 for each year of life that the person claims. So a 10-year-old would cost about $1,000 to buy false papers for.
When David G. arrived in San Francisco, he was detained at the Angel Island Immigration Station.
As most Chinese who were coming through China at that time came through Angel Island, which is an island off the coast of San Francisco, in San Francisco Bay. And it was a very harsh place because they were, well, they were rightfully looking for people that were breaking the law. And unfortunately, my dad was one.
After almost a year on Angel Island, David G. was granted permission to stay. He eventually married and settled with his wife in Houston, Texas, where he worked in the grocery business.
There was discrimination, and of course there were natural barriers of language and just knowing how to navigate, how to get around and what to do. So there were some elders who were well-spoken, that were respected in the mainstream community that really helped our family.
That social support is a very important aspect of the growth of the Chinese populations in anywhere, but particularly in the South.
Chow says the first large group of Chinese immigrants arrived in Houston in the 1940s and 50s. Racial segregation was legal in Texas and southern states through a series of codes known as Jim Crow laws.
Even though Houston also was subject to Jim Crow law, the law wasn't applied the same way as the other southern states. And so there's a sense of more equity in Houston. That's where people come, a sense of business opportunity. So these are the early Chinese American settlers.
They were just in between and just depended upon how well the neighborhood or people accepted them.
Albert G., as president of the Houston Restaurant Association, took part in the desegregation of Houston's restaurants in the early 1960s. Little did he know that his work in the community would be immortalized in a web comic decades later.
Kids all across the state of Texas are reading the comic.
The comic is part of an online platform called Adventures of Asia, developed by the Asia Society Texas. The organization also collaborated with the Houston Asian American Archive to develop lesson guides for teachers called Asia in the Classroom.
One thing teachers said is when they're teaching about U.S. history, Texas history, they want those local stories featured. And our Asian American students in particular said they want to see themselves represented.
Asians have been living in Texas for more than 150 years, with Chinese being the first to arrive. Census data shows that of the U.S. states, Texas has the third largest Asian American population, with Asian Americans making up about 6%. The Asian population in the U.S. had nearly doubled from 2000 to 2019 and is expected to continue to grow, according to the Pew Research Center. But the history of Asians who settled in the U.S. is missing from many textbooks.
There was a study that looked at 30 U.S. history textbooks from across the U.S., and they found that Asian American history was only mentioned in half of them, and of that half, it was an average of about 1 to 2 pages in the entire textbook. So it's been a big gap.
One way to fill the gap is to turn Asian American stories, such as Albert G's life, into a web comic.
There's such a plethora of resources around the G family. It's a large network here in Houston, too. There's stories of first generation, second generation, third generation G family members that continue to contribute to the city.
And continue to teach later generations that life is not only about where you start, where you end up, or even how successful you are. It's also about leaving a legacy, making a positive difference in the lives of others in the community. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News, Houston.